Hello, everybody. My name is Lisa. I am the owner and operator of Nutrition Coaching and Life, and you may have seen some of our previous videos from our research group, The Rise. In this video, I am going to do a research recap from one of those meetings, one of those presentations that we had at the beginning of the year, but I just wanted to share it with you guys because I thought it was a very interesting topic. Of course, if you enjoy in general this channel, all the other things that we do, for example, our lives on the Tuesdays or our podcasts on Fridays, please subscribe, give us a rating or review on the podcast as well. Share the podcast on your social media just to help us grow and also to promote some of this content, which hopefully you find valuable. So in today's session, I want to talk about the effectiveness of interventions and behavior change techniques for improving dietary intake in young adults. This was a systematic review and meta-analysis of randomized controlled trials. So in an published article by Ashton et al. In 2019. In the introduction of this paper, they described how they went about it. So young adults, 20 to 29 years old, tend to have some of the unhealthiest eating habits compared to other age groups, is how they introduced or how they gave us a bit of a background into this topic. Quote, low diet quality indicates lower intakes of healthier items from the core food groups such as fruits and vegetables, whole grains, and key nutrients, including omega-3s and dietary fiber, and higher intakes of energy-dense, nutrient-poor foods such as processed meats, sugar-sweetened beverages, saturated and trans fats, and sodium. These poor eating habits are often attributed to major life transitions throughout this time: instability in habitation, relationship, employment status. What that essentially means is that in our 20s, we move around more. We are not quite as steady in where we're located or in our business or in even our marriage or whatever we might have. And because of all these transitions, there are more challenges when it comes to food, as one might expect, or maybe we live alone, so we don't pay as much quality to that. We have a career focus, so we don't care as much if we don't eat super healthy or if we don't exercise. Another quote, poor diet quality is one of the leading causes of mortality and disability worldwide, and therefore intervening while adults are still young is central to the prevention of non-communicable chronic diseases and promotion of healthy aging. Essentially saying it would be great to change those habits early on and to give people a focus on health early on, as opposed to waiting until we reach our 40s, we're unhealthy, we're unhappy in our bodies, all these health markers are starting to turn, and then having to change something, because we all know the older we are, when we want to change habits, the more difficult they probably are to change because they're so ingrained in us. In the aim of this systematic review and meta-analysis was twofold. The first one was to evaluate the effectiveness of interventions aiming to improve dietary intake among healthy young adults. So they chose people between 17 to 35, and to identify behavior change techniques used in these interventions and to determine which are most effective. And that's one of the reasons why I picked this article, because of course in the end it is my aim, number one, to improve my coaching skills and the techniques that I use with our clients, but also to give you, the listener, the viewer, more techniques, more tools, so that you know what to apply. In the methods, so they included 54 randomized controlled trials, studies which primarily investigated the acute impact of weight loss on other clinical biomarkers like insulin were excluded. So this is really about the behavior. The meta-analysis of change in total energy intake was conducted for 5 of those 54 studies. Meta-analysis of change in fruit and vegetable intake per gram per day was conducted across 17 studies to assess change in reported intakes at each time point for both intervention and control groups. We're going to go right into the results, but we will hear more about the studies as well. So over half of the studies included studies that had dietary change as a primary outcome, while dietary change was a secondary outcome for the remaining. In the studies with dietary change as a primary outcome, most focused on fruit and or vegetable intake, while the remaining focused on diet quality score, micronutrients, or percentage of energy coming from fat. So this is kind of where I don't want to say I had a problem with, but I mean, just because someone consumes a ton of vegetables and fruits doesn't necessarily mean that it is a healthy diet. They could still be in a huge energy surplus. They could still be consuming a ton of cookies. They could still be consuming very, very little protein. So, of course, we have to keep in mind that this is not a trial per se. This is not a study per se. This is a meta-analysis of other studies, randomized controlled trials that looked into all of these various components. But yeah, in my opinion, the term healthy should have been, how do I want to say, should have been determined or should have been expanded a little bit into perhaps also a specific amount of calories or a specific amount of protein. Of course, then we would have probably included far less studies into this meta-analysis. So it's always a bit of a, give and take when researchers have to essentially decide what they want to include in their research or not. But from the outside, it's always easy to talk. Nonetheless, it would have been nice to see. 25 studies used a food frequency questionnaire for assessment of dietary intake. 17 used a specific nutrient, etc. food diet behavior questionnaire, and 5 used a food record, and 5 used a dietary recall. For the recalls, 3 used a 24-hour recall, and 1 used a 3-day recall, and 1 used a 7-day recall. 2 studies used more than 1 method of dietary assessment. I mean, that's another thing we could argue about. We, as people that have tracked food before or are tracking food with MyFitnessPal and other slightly more accurate methods, know that something like a dietary recall questionnaire is very inaccurate. Like if I mean, I'm quite well aware of my food intake, but if I was to just go to my mom and be like, hey, what did you eat in the last 24 hours? She'd probably leave out a third of what she was eating. She would probably tweak something. I don't know. It's not super accurate, but of course, again, they have to make do with what they've got. And in many studies, that's just a lot simpler than teaching people how to track food, how to weigh out food, and so on. The mean intervention duration across the studies was 4.2 months, so that's actually really great. They ranged from a single session to 24 months, so up to 2 years, with the majority being short-term, between 1 single session and less than 3 months, so that was 40 of the studies. The mean length of follow-up from end of intervention was 1.8 months, so almost 2 months. And a few had no follow-ups at all. Some had a follow-up 24 months later, with the majority having between no follow-up and less than 3 months. So actually, very few had a long intervention. So now we're looking here at the behavior change techniques that were implemented in many of those. So the first one was goal setting when it comes to behavior. So for example, I am going to eat 5+ vegetables and fruit per day. Number 2 was problem solving. For instance, when I'm snacky at work, I'm going to grab a protein bar or an apple instead of the muffin. Action planning, reviewing behavioral goals. And if you find this list helpful for yourself or for your clients, feel free to take a screenshot of this as well. Other BCTs, we're going to name them, so behavior change techniques, were figuring out the discrepancy between behavior and goals, creating a behavioral contract, determining your commitment, monitoring your behavior through others without feedback or with feedback, self-monitoring of behavior, and so on. So there's lots of techniques that were implemented. Carrying on here actually, so for example, forming new habits, reversing old habits, substituting behavior, comparative imaging of future outcomes. So let's just say if you continue to smoke and not eat vegetables, you're gonna look like XYZ, as opposed to if you do this, you're gonna look completely different. So things like that. They also included other things like self-talk, imaginary reward, which in my opinion is very strong actually, or can be a very strong motivator. What sort of self-identity do you value? Lots and lots of things. So I highly recommend you take a screenshot of this, just because there's a lot of methods that you could be using for yourself or for your clients. Right, so here we have assessed, I'm sorry, I just realized my camera is on top of, or is overlapping with the results here. But what we're essentially looking at is the effectiveness of these behavior change techniques. And the results show no particular pattern as to whether fewer or more behavior change techniques were associated with effectiveness. But the most effective seems to be just the formation of new habits. The next most effective one seems to be the salience of consequences. So again, saying if you continue on this trajectory, you're gonna look XYZ. So just bringing up the like, what meaning is it going to have? What consequences are your current actions going to have versus your change? Adding objects to the environment, and that sounds kind of strange, but all that means is, like, if you're in an office and normally you don't have access to anything, maybe muffins, maybe donuts or whatever, you might now add a water cooler so that people drink more water instead of soda, and you might add a free fruit basket, or you might add in your own home, you might add more vegetables to the freezer or whatever. So that's kind of like the adding of objects to the environment. It can even be a visual reminder, a sticky note, anything like that. The next most effective one was action planning. Also not really that surprising, but if you say, okay, every single Sunday I'm actually going to go to the vegetable store and purchase vegetables, you're more likely to eat vegetables than if you don't have them at home. Prompts and cues, I guess that was more the sticky note thingy that I was referring to. Goal setting. So again, you can take a picture of this, and this is kind of ranked according to this, how effective, or to this systematic review and meta-analysis, what they believe to be most effective. Yeah, well, I'll get more into some of the specific ones later on. So there were several discussion points of this. Predominantly, studies that targeted fruit and or vegetable intake as the primary outcome demonstrated a significant increase of fruit and vegetables. Not surprisingly, because if you target something, you're more likely to have a specific outcome than if you don't target something, if that makes sense. And a meta-analysis exploring change in, what was TEI? Sorry, what was that? I think also, like, vegetable intake or healthy food intake in general showed no significant differences between groups. So this is kind of contradicting the first statement. There was a narrative synthesis that showed that interventions targeting fruit and or vegetable intake were most effective. If they were, and the next most effective in terms of overall health changes was the change of energy-dense beverages, then the change of nutrient-dense foods, and the last one was macronutrients altogether. So I guess some of them did assess, like, protein and so on intake, or maybe less saturated fat intake. But yeah, so I guess the easiest intervention, where the easiest target point of, if you have a 20-year-old kid and their diet is atrocious, the easiest way to get them what they can change would be to add an apple per day, or a couple of carrots or something like that. Next most easy target would be to get them to drink less diet soda, and perhaps or regular soda and perhaps swap it for diet soda. The next most easy entryway will be, what really nutrient-dense foods are you currently eating? Oh, you're eating a crap ton of mac and cheese. Maybe you can just change that for regular pasta with tomato sauce, or anything else that's a little bit lighter. And then the last one, the macronutrients, so less saturated fats. So swapping out tons of butter and other and red meat for some chicken and olive oil, for instance. The behavior change techniques with the highest percentage effectiveness ratio were habit formation, so creation of a new habit, meaning every time you have breakfast, you're going to add that apple. That's a habit. Salience of consequences, again, just demonstrating what that means. If you carry on this trajectory, you're going to look like that in a few years' time, versus if you change, you're going to look very different in a few years' time. And then the third one was adding objects to the environment. So simply putting more fruit in the kitchen increased the likeliness of people eating more fruit as well. Despite this, the overall test of significance demonstrated no significant relationship between type of behavior change technique and effectiveness. So in general, it seems like any of the techniques that we mentioned is probably going to be somewhat effective still, or not necessarily more effective than the other, because it also obviously depends on the person and the circumstances. So there's another part to this discussion. So possible reason for fruit and vegetables being the main visible change, and fruit and vegetable as a primary outcome was the primary outcome. Again, if you have a primary outcome in a study, it's very likely that that's going to change, as opposed to if it's only secondary or tertiary outcome. Also, young adults may identify health problems to be distal, and therefore do not perceive a need to change their eating habits. And I think that's very true. If you think, oh, well, I'm 20, what do I care if my cholesterol is high when I'm 60? They don't see that it's a lifetime exposure, or that changing that habit now is going to make it so much easier later, as opposed to starting to work on it when you're 49 and it's already gone, maybe not to horrible levels, but to like detrimental health levels nonetheless, you not being at your optimal health. And young adults have a number of competing time demands, which may be prioritized over making changes to their eating habits. So yeah, that's sort of what we were saying. If you're mid to late 20s, you're focusing on your career, you might have just gotten married, you have young kids, and so on, you're very likely to put yourself last, and maybe stress eat, maybe engage in some emotional eating, all these sorts of things. So again, let's talk about examples for behavior change techniques. So we have habit formation. That means promoting participants to fill half of their plate with either salad or cooked vegetables at night, at dinner. So that's just one example. Salience of consequences. I've spoken about this a few times. Presenting visual images of the negative consequences of eating unhealthily. For example, blocked arteries and so on. You see that often from like smokers or smoking, negative consequences on the package. You have like someone with rotten teeth or a black foot or something like that. Third one, information about health consequences. So simply telling people more or providing more knowledge. So that intervention includes providing participants with morbidity and mortality statistics from related health conditions. So just telling them, if you continue with this, your chance of death is this high versus other times this high, and so on. Then another one, the adding of the objects, so providing participants with free fruit or vegetable box to facilitate healthy eating. Setting goals, that means participants set a goal of eating 2 pieces of fruit per day, and were instructed to write plans of when and where they would consume an extra piece of vegetable per day for the next week. So yeah, those were some examples. And in conclusion, they stated, this systematic review and meta-analysis highlights the potential of lifestyle behavioral interventions to improve young adults' fruit and vegetable intake, but the evidence was less convincing for other dietary outcomes. when I discuss this in the research group or so, we often say like, okay, well, this is all well and good, but it's kind of far from like, well, what does that actually mean? I once again acknowledge that it would have been nice to have like other things in there, as in calories overall or protein or so, but in my opinion, if we just focus on the techniques and think about how this meta-analysis and systematic review um, is potentially providing some information as to what we can extrapolate for our own coaching practices or for ourselves. I think that there are some pretty cool things. If you set people, it just simply says if you set a specific goal, that's already helpful, as opposed to not even talking about it. If you're like, okay, I know I need to increase my fiber. But what does that actually mean? So with our nutrition coaching clients, for instance, since we track food in the metric or in MyFitnessPal or other dietary tracker, it makes it easier because you're monitoring it. And so therefore you can say next week, I really want you to hit 20 to 30 grams. Therefore you have a target. And then you start talking more about, okay, how are we going to make that work? At what time of the day are you including more fiber? What kind of fiber sources do we have? And so that goes back to some of the other things, um, like the adding of the objects, so making things more visible. I think that that is super, super helpful, even with kids. If you have brownies sitting out on the counter, they're more likely to eat the brownies and not ask for fruit than if you have fruit sitting out on the counter and the brownies actually in the cupboard, where you haven't even baked the brownie, and then they might just have the fruit because they're hungry. So yeah, there's lots of ways. Again, we looked at these all these various behavior change techniques here. Essentially, if you're a coach, I think just look at that. The social support too is super, super helpful. We know, or I know from my coaching practice, if there is a couple and they both want to lose weight, or at least if someone has the support of their partner, it is so much easier than if the partner is kind of like, oh, why are you changing? You're great at the way that you are. You don't need to lose any weight. It's all good. Or even just if their environment, if their friends are all non-exercisers and they're wanting to start to exercise or so, it's so much harder than if you just give them a little bit of support and you're like, hey, there's another person in your building block. They're also wanting to start running more. Why don't you guys go together? Or you make a friend who also likes to eat healthy, and at least that way you're a bit more encouraged. So there's lots of things that we can, as coaches, look at and think about implementing in our coaching and even for ourselves. So having a specific commitment, having a strong why, essentially, in addition to setting the SMART goals, in addition to having the accountability, I think that's what it all boils down to. But yeah, once again, if you want to read the whole meta-analysis and systematic review, it was titled Effectiveness of Interventions and Behavior Change Techniques for Improving Dietary Intake in Young Adults. This was by Ashton et al. From 2019. Please go and check it out on PubMed or wherever you like. If you enjoy these sort of reviews, or just in general have any requests for future research for me to look into, please drop them in the comments. I would love for you to subscribe to our channel. And of course, I thank you for listening.